Hi, everyone. I would like to thank the Lahore Literary Festival and Asia Society for hosting an invaluable opportunity to share work and ideas, and to all of you for your time and interest. Disruption as Raptor is a video work with original music born from selected folios of the 18th century Golshan-i-Ish manuscript in Philadelphia Museum's collection. The work is now permanently installed in the South Asia galleries of the Philadelphia Art Museum. In 2015, the museum reached out to me to develop a multi-dimensional work to bring the historical manuscript to life. The premise was ambitious and challenging, as there were more than 90 visual illustrations and over 4,500 verses of untranslated Dakkani Urdu. I knew that to make an effective transition from past to present, one had to use imagination as a tool. I reached out to two very close long-term collaborators, Duyan, who had composed original scores for all of my work since 2009, and Patrick O'Rourke, with whom I have been working on animating my drawings since early 2000. The trust and deep grasp of each other's languages, methodologies, pace, and abilities is the foundation of the collaborative thrust of this particular work. We had already created many audiovisual works, such as The Last Post and the highly acclaimed multi-channel film Parallax, which has been on a world tour since 2014. So here I'd like to emphasize that collaboration for me is born from a deep investment into respecting and engaging the autonomy of the other. Ali Sethi's point of entry into the work emerged as the missing link, a mysterious leap of faith. We ran into each other in one of his visits to New York, and after we met with Duyan, the composer of the score for Disruption as Raptor, we were brainstorming and recording in the studio within a day. The Golshan-i-Ish, or the Garden of Love, an epic poem, an allegorical tale, was written in 1657-58 by Nusrati, court poet to Sultan Ali Adil Shah II of Bijapur. The poem is also written in Dakkani Urdu and Persian Naqsh script, the language of the Muslim elite in south-central India, a North Indian Hindu love story recast as a Sufi tale for an Islamic court. The story is a classic tale of star-crossed lovers who must face daunting challenges and painful separation before they can unite. The poet recounts this tale of connection, separation, longing, and the final union of lovers by creating a world full of lush gardens and magical beings where the love story emerges as a metaphor for a soul's search for and connection with the divine. My work is deeply connected to the act of drawing. Drawing is my thinking tool. It functions like a libretto in my work. Drawing on paper, as witnessed in the folios of the Golshan-i-Ish manuscript, has an aspect of infinity in that it doesn't end at the edge of the sheet, but hints at a narrative continuing beyond. That idea has been at the core of my dismantling traditional miniature paintings. The intent is to transform motifs in order to cultivate new associations for trenchant historical symbols, and this way I can service more than one vantage point. The main recurring metaphor of the garden was an obvious visual clue. In the video, you will notice that many of the movements are around nature and how certain images lend themselves to movement. Like you will notice here, there are two types of converging movements, the gopi hair silhouettes and the energetic and dramatic firework-like forms made from hundreds of wings. At this point, Ali's use of raga, jogya, is quite apt and subversive. He extends the mystical mood of the jogya by delivering the alap in a thumri. The reference to the feminine is a delicate link to the tumultuous energy field made from the millions of the gopi female hair used as particle systems. The movement is ominous yet intoxicating. A recurring form, one of many I've developed as part of my visual language, is a silhouette of the hair worn by a female worshipper of Krishna known as Gopi. Early in my practice, I began developing a personal vocabulary, an alphabet of sorts in which forms could serve as stock figures and no longer had to hold on to their original meaning. The single unit of the Gopi hair silhouette has tremendous possibilities. When reproduced in the millions, the hair silhouettes operate as a pulsating mass of movement that oscillates between several representations, such as swarms, birds, bats, waves, or water. What is important is the kinetic thrust of the form. It's simultaneously tangible, a rigid icon, and elusive, constantly morphing and altering. Powerful and subliminal, the beauty of the Gopi hair particles is that they can operate as both the unhinged and the durable. The use of wings is a deliberate reference to flight. Flight is a recurring notion in this work, functioning often for the realm of the imagination, as well as the search of internal enlightenment. Nusrati's poem, in Masnavi format and its reference to Sufi symbolism, functions as a connecting tissue, and the flight motifs used throughout the work also carry the theme of strife, the struggle for the truth. To engage the multiple narratives within Golshan-i-Ish, it was important for me to keep in mind the ethos of the work from within its historical and socio-political period. The religious and cultural plurality at play is an important lens in time. Imaginative possibilities abound within the world itself, not just within the realm of the mind. The world is full of mystery, containing within it a variety of distances between the real and the imagined. I'm interested in that dynamism of form as something alive and in relationship to its space, technique, and time. Disruption as a means of exploration is full of rapture. The notion is to unhinge so that the story is freed to witness its own history and empower its own narrative, functioning as a force and engine for survival. The work calls into question the philosophical and the political with the unfolding of narrative based on shifting migratory patterns, interactions, cultural quarantine, autonomous verbal poetic languages, and the quest for the sacred in the personal. I would like to invite all of you now to witness the work, and it's a 10-minute piece, and I hope you enjoy it.
लागी लगन तो से रैन अंधेरी डराए, जियरा मोरा लरजे अब के चैन न आए। लागी लगन तो से रैन अंधेरी डरा जीरा मेरा घर से खींचे न आए
Well, first, congratulations. It's really an amazing experience. And it's, the notion of kinetic and narrative are what really occur to me. And because I can imagine the imagery is one component of this idea of rupture. But another component of it is the sonic text and the interplay between the imagery and the sound and the text itself. So I wondered if you could start off by just talking about how you imagined the piece and then how you layered it with your collaborators.
Well, I have been collaborating with Jian for almost a decade, and then with Patrick, who does all the animation work also. So there is already this history and the trust of that relationship and ability to work together. I think the very beautiful part is that the way Ali's expertise in his understanding of the classical creates this sort of rupture in the work and allows a completely different language to participate. And I think a lot of that is just the mystery of the work. It's also born out of our individual interest in tradition and how we engage with it, how we embrace it. And I think for that I would love to hear both of you in terms of your particular experience of working on this work.
I think the three of us share this commonality, which is we born and are raised in a very rigid classical training, be it in visual art, be it in raga singing, be it in classical writing music. So the thinking of how to really examine tradition and how can we have that freedom outside of that is the impetus of how our collaboration begins and exploring that. So working with Ali is fantastic because I wanted you to say that, yes.
Why is fantastic working with me?
Yes.
I don't find it fantastic working with myself, I have to say. But you're right that, Dune is right to say that coming from within a tradition, and from within a tradition that has been certainly in my case, and I think also in Shahzia's case, but even in Duyun's case, we were just talking about this at the cafeteria earlier, ossified tradition which is saturated and which is, there's been a lot of conversation around it, and so the conversation is almost closed in on itself over many centuries of layer upon layer upon layer of building from, say, a raga which I sing in this at the moment of ascension when the prince is ascending. Shahzia said, what do we have something that speaks to this moment? And it came to me. It was the rag Amen which is popularly attributed to Amir Khusro, who was the 13th century polymath. But the moment I thought about it, Aman means, it's from, well, it's contested, as are most of these things, but Aman is from Aman, which is peace. Peace-inducing, right? That which induces peace. And the way I have been taught this particular raga by my teacher, who is literally the descendant of the first pupil Amir Khusro taught. Like the whole family tree goes back. So it's very heavy with sort of filial obligation, the passing on of these things, and one cannot play with them lightly within the tradition.
And Shahzia, this is not our first collaboration. This is maybe 3 or 4th at least. One of her language, and I often find again and again, is that she turns into this landscape and boom, goes to another motif and this ascension that you always have that like colored dots and all that. So that in musical structure, it's very important. It's that musical language that we call it like the structural pivot point, right? That how you think about the phrasing ending and the phrasing ascending. So I know that her language so well, and because that is also very important in my writing as well. So when we hear that, when we see that, I know we're going to have that moment, and when we identify what raga we're going to sing, and I'm thinking, okay, so we cannot just stop at a raga, because then it's just like you putting a rhythm on top of raga. That's the thing that we do not want to do. So where I'm looking at also choir moment of this like orthodox chant moment is also about ascension. So it's and also in terms of orchestral tonality speaking, that is the ascension tonality up.
So it's interesting. What I'm hearing is a kind of structured, when you think of rupture and tradition, you're thinking of it giving you some content, and yet you're still working within a structure that you are creating yourselves.
Right.
Yeah, I think that is a beautiful chemistry, I think, between all the 3 languages. And I think the aim for me was to create a work which would be multivalent, which would be able to straddle multiple languages without an emphasis on synthesis. It's important that there's dissonance. It's important that everybody's voice is visible, because that's in my pursuit of what I've been doing for decades, is that I want to create a link to this incredible, vast tradition. And it's alive for me. And I think it starts to reveal itself when you dig in its direction. And it doesn't matter whether one is experimenting and moving out and coming back. Like, the security is there. It's not a departure that you cannot return back to, but it's a truncated tradition, and that's the larger problematics of how it's perceived and understood and placed within art history context. But nonetheless, I think it's a wonderful connecting point between the 3 of our works.
And we actually literally played around with the addressed beloved idea. Could you tell?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things, when I began my apprenticeship with my teacher, one of the things, it's an oral tradition. There's no written language for Indo-Pakistani, Hindustani, or Carnatic music. It's sort of one of the running jokes is, when am I gonna be done with my apprenticeship? Like when am I gonna be done with stage 1? And they're like, oh, you're just beginning. It's sort of like always you're always beginning. And this idea that every day is a beginning, and that you're still at the beginning of the beginning, and that's a way of orienting how you think about how you approach it. Anyway, so one of the sort of the tropes, as it were, that has come down to me from my teacher is this sort of the mode of address within the lyric that accompanies many of these, what we call bandishes, right? Bandish from, literally confinement, or mooring, right? And a bandish is just a composition that you sing to practice your melodic, sort of to hone your melodic skill and your sensibility and to develop the voice. So they're sort of like melodic exercises which come with these stock lyrical phrases. Within the first few weeks, I put this question to my teacher. I said, "But why is it always a woman who's addressing a man in this context?" Well, not always, but a lot of the time, there's a sort of a woman yearner is addressing an ambiguous but potentially male beloved. And my teacher said, I would love to reproduce in his Khalis Urdu the way he said it, and then I can translate. He said, "Ilaqai fitrat bhi ek cheez hoti hai." There is such a thing as a regional temperament. He said, "Barre sagir mein aurat mard ko chahti hai." Ye har jagah hai, bas hai aisa. So in the Indian subcontinent, Indo-Pakistan, it is women who desire men. And he said, Arab mein mard aurat ko chahta hai. He said, in the Arab world, it is the man who yearns for it. He said, और कुछ ऐसे भी इलाके हैं जहाँ मर्द को चाहता है, ये भी हकीकत है, इसमें बहस नहीं हो सकती. There are also parts of the world, such as Iran, he said, such as the Persian world, where the man is yearning for a male beloved. Or a male voice yearns for a male, apparently.
And this is tradition, right?
This is tradition. There you go. This is tradition. This is
But
tradition.
that's the beauty of
this
tradition.
Is tradition. So when we
So
sat
desire
down,
has been around for a long time.
so when we sat down to do this, one of the really radical things for me, and I think for all of us actually, because we had these many like sort of startled, sort of like breathtaking moments in the course of our collaboration, was finding how these apparently traditional lyrics suddenly became, they were so activated in the context of this work. I mean, there was no dearth of possibilities. I would just turn to one phrase, Mori naiya par karo, float my raft across this river, which is the first exercise with which you begin. It's like a prayer to God to give you the sur, to give you the musical rightness. From that to, Radha, the Radha sort of figure, who then turns into Heer in Punjabi, who turns into Soni in Sindhi, who's yearning for union with the beloved and has to cross a stormy river at night, or has to fight with the world, has to sort of battle with convention. All of that became simultaneously possible, and that was one of the great.
But see, that is the beauty of these two languages, because they're already interconnected. There's so much of what you're dealing with that already happens within the frameworks of the manuscript, within the frameworks of the Indo-Persian miniature tradition. And I think this opportunity allowed those two languages to emerge as a collaborative work.
Right.
So the two languages are the visual and the sonic? The two languages are...
The rag
itself?
ragas, the classical grasp of the classical ragas, its history. And what for me, the interesting thing is that the representation of the ragas and their evocative mood and their feminine, masculine states also are represented in the Ragamala paintings.
And I think one of the really exciting things for me was how Dion's score, over which I sang, kind of defamiliarized the raga space for me. Because usually what happens is that, and this is a recurring argument I'm having while I'm recording music in Pakistan, is that a lot of young musicians keep saying, oh, but the ragas are too typical. They'll say, oh, but it's so typical, that movement, that melodic gesture, the way you wrap it up is so standard, it's so familiar. Can't we do something new or interesting? And I keep saying, we can do something interesting, we can have a departure, but that departure has to be informed. It can't just be because the raga itself is so informed.
That's
it's coming
the key,
from
I
such
think, actually, this idea of informed.
So Dion's musical score was itself coming from this very richly informed place.
Because
but it served to defamiliarize what I was doing, and that defamiliarization actually helped renew and draw attention to the sort of potential of meaning within the raga space, which otherwise in a traditional context, if I'd had just a Tanpura playing behind me, would not have been activated.
Exactly. Well, it's not just because I don't speak the language. It's not just because this is not my part of tradition. But I have to argue that it is part of my tradition, and because this issue is not only to Pakistan. This is the issue also very particular to China as well. If you look at China, we have this operatic styles that is 1,000 years, and people saying that we should not It's a museum piece, right?
Right.
So what we are, when I say we, as contemporary artists, as a contemporary human being, confronting those languages, and then we're like, if we cannot touch something that is museum piece, then what do we have for our future generations?
There you go.
And it's not because we put on lights, we put on beats, we put on things. We have to understand what is that structural meanings. That's the narration? What is the narrative discourse? What is that the arch of narration? What the storytelling is?
Well, it seems to me, in some sense, what you're saying is that the tradition is embodied in you. Is it just a different way of saying what you said? You're informed because it's in your form. And out of that, then you can be creative because you actually have some knowledge. It's not a surface interaction.
And it's also not a random juxtaposition, right, between the three of us. So you have to take into consideration that there is already a very charged energy behind each individual's process and work and its provenance and all of that. It was a great opportunity that it fell into place. And when opportunities like that happen, I think that's the instinct, that's the intuition that you run with. But without the knowledge, the intuition could be
it's so
very
powerful when you go
empty.
from the your singing to the kind of choral music, and you change into a totally different world, and it makes you just feel the piece. I was trying to imagine the piece without that sound. I thought, oh my, it's so integrated into the experience.
Because it's not a postmodernist approach. Because when postmodern approach is that you take things at liberty and fit as you use, what we're trying to do is really understanding what structure means to each of us. And when you study classical Indian music, I, as a musician, I often astonished to hear, oftentimes that the ending is the beginning. Boom goes. There's no classical sense of cadence, or it's boom, right? And that boom moment to me is a very Buddhism or Hinduism like sudden just realization of self and a spiritual journey that is very in tune with how I grew up as well. So when animation happens like that, because it's essentially time-based art form, and you have to understand what that structure means. And when the demon comes in, but it's already wedding scenes, but I have to let Ali's voice hovering above, so that that is the new beginning.
But I want to point out that even though the form is animation and there's movement, but a lot of that already existed in the older manuscripts.
Right.
When you look at them, they hint at this world that's on the borders, that's in the corner. So it's not like, it's a microcosm of multiple periods and times, and that movement was always visible. The idea was like how to pull it apart, how to make it speak to the world. And I think that also is a dismantling that has happened over many years, at least for me. And in that dismantling, when you reassemble, you learn. You learn another way of saying something. And all these iterations are important because you're learning. So this pursuit of knowledge is self-evident. And I think that's a level of trust there that definitely happened in the way this work came through. And also the fourth collaborator is Patrick O'Rourke, and I've worked with Patrick for 15 years. So that there is a reason why the animation kind of functions at all these levels.
So one last question, then I'm going to open it up to all of you, which is just the process. Did you make the piece, the visual piece first, and then you scored to that? How did that work?
Simultaneous. We have been working in this way for a long time.
I was looking at the manuscript from the very start.
So the collaboration really started from the beginning of the work.
I refused to only score to and already made animation. Because it's not interesting,
animation is a very odd word for this work, and and it's also for us, it's a dialogue. So the work bleeds into a relationship, and then that constantly informs the work.
Well, sometimes I prefer the verb animating. Like you're animating each other, you're animating the different media. It's a little more active than, the noun.
I do want to say that the piece at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we actually also, not just looking at a manuscript, we're looking at a space as well. I went there to examine what kind of space, and I proposed for a 7.1 surround sound. So what you're experiencing is actually a very immersive visual audio.
How big would this be if we were seeing it there?
No, so the piece is very intimate there, but it's in 4K, which is incredible technology. Yeah. So it's alive. It's like just alive on the surface.
Everybody should go to Philadelphia and
But which means that the nature of this work is such that I could project it in Times Square if I wanted to. So the technology is ahead of its time.
Can I say one thing, just one last thing before we? For me, I think when I went into the project, I didn't know what to expect. It often happens. I go into a recording studio, and some music composer will say, "Out with it! Let's have all the classical stuff now," that sort of thing. So I didn't know what to expect, but the really unexpected, miraculous part of this collaboration was a feeling of liberation that I had by the end of it. And that's the paradox and the beauty of this kind of work and this process, is to through tradition, quote unquote, right, through the classical, words that tend to oppress us, to find liberation, is the mystery and the beauty, and that therein lies the mystical secret of this whole process.
I mean, you've so clearly elucidated that process was at the core. And really thinking, I mean, that's why I love this conversation, because the idea that tradition is alive. Obviously, at some point, it was thought up. It wasn't always the tradition. Exactly. And I love the idea of the beginning, right? And then the fact that you say, okay, well, we believe that this is something we absolutely interact with in the present moment, and it's relevant to the present moment.
Because it passes through you,
Yeah.
That's how I see it. It's like always, it's like history, it's a connecting tissue. And of course, how do you create ownership? Through imagination, which then becomes a political stance.
Sure.
Nothing to do with fake news. Maybe we could bring the lights up a little bit. We have some microphones, because there are some people watching online. If you could raise your hands. If you have a question, we can take a couple. Yes, right here.
Thank you so much, all of you, for a really beautiful work. I wanted to suggest or ask a couple of things. The first was that I think your discomfort with the word animation is valid, because animation suggests enlivening something that might be dead, to animate, whereas really the question in most of your work, Shahzia, which I've followed for so long now, is why does it move us so much? It's so moving, and there is literally also movement in this kind of a piece. So I think some play on the word movement might be more accurate than animation. But that's just a thought. The other thing I was thinking, again, with your vocabulary, what you said about the headpiece of the gopis, which you have used over a very long period of time, and they become birds, and they go back to being hairpieces, and all kinds of transformations occur in that, using that alphabet. Most of it is, as you said, about flight, right? It's an aleatory kind of migratory symbol, you said, which I think also gives some hint of your relationship with this tradition, right? That you are engaged with it, but you're also in flight from it. you're also constantly leaving the frame through these moving pieces that are going outwards, right? And in that way, exploding the frame itself in that moment. Whereas when you spoke, it was very interesting. You kept talking about the security and the comfort of return rather than the motion of movement away, the flight away. I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that a little bit.
Well, I think that the question is, what is tradition, what is contemporary? Because if you examine some of the manuscripts and understand when they were made and the context of their making, they're very contemporary artifacts. They were made in context to their lived time and space. So that perhaps is the oscillating idea, that no matter what one does, it's going to be in sync, in context to one's lived experience. But the thing is, how do you create ownership with something that was in the past? How does that become a continuity? And for that, I think there are moments when there's flight and you create new discourse, like parallax and multi-channel works that are incredibly new and diverse in their experiential capacity. It's exciting, but it's always about the new. It's always about the next. It's about the beginning. Because for me, that is a very important frame, that not to just constantly reinvent yourself, but once you're finished, then you have to start again. You have to learn it all over again. You have to learn something new. Like it's the thrust of pursuit of knowledge. And how do you position yourself to this idea of flight and the return?
I mean, I guess there's like a purely metaphysical way of looking at something like that, but then in a very personal way, I think, like Duyun said, this is now a very widespread condition of the heart, if you will. This desire to both belong, to be embedded in, to be engaged with, to be local, which originally means to be intimate with. It's not a spatial confinement.
Yeah. It's not geographical.
It's not geographical.
Like symbols are not based on
and this
geography.
is something that we find in so many senses applies to us today. This desire to both, be intimate with, to be present in one place, but then also to engage multiply. And we do this through technology. We do this through the many languages we speak. We do this in terms of living the kinds of very mixed up multicultural lives we live. So I think when actually one is engaging with what is now traditional simply because it's 300 years prior to where we are, one of the really exciting things is activating or rekindling that sense of contemporaneity within those works. So for me, that's a very meaningful, powerful political thing in my life. It's a way of saying, I am not separate from this tradition, while at the same time saying tradition is open to interpretation for me. So I am neither willing to be anti-traditional, right, which is the choice that is often offered to one these days. You're either with us or against us. It's that kind of binary oppression. Or it's you reject everything but tradition, which is also something that's very prevalent in our world. And one is just being honest with oneself.
I also want to add that for example, if one had freer access to the documents, to this incredible objects and histories, then we may not. It would become a norm. So it's also how you cast a relationship to history is important. How you access it, how you're trained to access it. That type of gatekeeping becomes very much an active, participatory idea, whether it's the institution or whether it's the cultural history or the.
And I think as an individual artist, the vocabulary, the content can be spiritual, can be all that. but the stance that you take is absolutely political and social and economic, on all that, because we have to have that understanding of who we are and understanding what that voice means to the society, to multiple societies at large.
I mean, that feels very current and immediate.
Absolutely.
To say this is absolutely of this moment. I'm sorry we're going to have to stop here because we have another session in just a few minutes. But please join me in thanking so much this wonderful panel.
Thank you.